Avoidants don't attach when you love them harder. They attach when you stop orbiting them. That statement alone disrupts almost everything people believe about avoidant attachment. Most assume avoidants are emotionally unavailable because they fear intimacy, vulnerability, or commitment. That explanation sounds neat and comforting, but it's incomplete. Intimacy isn't the real trigger. If it were, avoidance would detach from everyone equally. Instead, they often stay in relationships for years, distant, conflicted, half present, while never fully attaching. The deeper truth is this: avoidants don't fear closeness itself. They fear the loss of autonomy while still being emotionally required. They fear being needed in a way that restricts their internal freedom. When love starts to feel like an obligation rather than a choice, their nervous system reads danger. This is why loving an avoidant harder almost always backfires. More reassurance, more availability, more emotional investment doesn't feel like safety to them. It feels like surveillance. It feels like being tracked, monitored, subtly obligated to show up in ways they never learned to sustain. Even when they care deeply, their body doesn't experience that care as grounding. It experiences it as pressure. And pressure is what activates their deactivation strategies: emotional withdrawal, logic, overfeeling, delayed responses, sudden distance, not because they don't feel, but because feeling while being needed creates an internal conflict they don't know how to resolve. What actually draws an avoidant into attachment is contrast, not closeness. Contrast between who you are when you're focused on them and who you are when you're centered in yourself. When your emotional world stops revolving around their availability, something unexpected happens inside them. Their system registers relief. The invisible weight of being responsible for your emotional state lifts. For the first time, they can approach connection without the fear that it will consume them. That's the paradox most people miss. The moment you stop chasing an avoidant is often the moment they begin to notice you more deeply. The shift isn't dramatic, it's subtle, almost quiet. You don't announce it. You don't pull away to provoke them. You simply stop organizing your emotions around their responses. You become less reactive, less explanatory, less invested in managing the dynamic. And that contrast creates psychological space. In that space, the avoidance mind starts doing something new. It fills the absence with reflection, not panic. Reflection, not anxiety, awareness. They begin to sense that access to you is no longer guaranteed, and yet you're not angry, cold, or punishing. You're simply present in yourself. That's the exact moment something inside them shifts. Their nervous system, which once associated closeness with loss of control, now associates you with stability without demand. And that is the doorway to attachment for an avoidant. Not intensity, not pursuit, but the quiet realization that connection can exist without cost to their autonomy. Avoidants are wired to associate love with pressure, not because love itself is dangerous, but because their earliest experiences of connection came with invisible conditions. Care was often paired with expectation. Affection came with strings. Attention required performance. Somewhere early on, their nervous system learned a quiet rule: closeness means obligation. So as adults, even when they genuinely like someone, their body doesn't experience love as comfort. It experiences it as demand. This isn't a conscious belief, it's a physiological imprint. Before their mind can assess the relationship, their system is already bracing for loss of freedom. This is why avoidants resist attachment at the beginning, even when everything seems healthy on the surface. When someone pursues them, reassures them, explains their feelings in detail, or patiently waits through inconsistency, it doesn't land as devotion. It lands as pressure. Each act of emotional effort signals, I will need something from you soon. And the avoidance nervous system immediately scans for escape routes. Not because they don't care, but because caring has historically meant being trapped in someone else's emotional needs. To the non-avoidant, these behaviors feel loving. Pursuit feels like interest. Reassurance feels like safety. Explaining feels like clarity. Waiting feels like loyalty. But to an avoidant, they can feel like surveillance, like being emotionally monitored. The unspoken message their body hears is, I'm being watched, measured, and eventually I'll be expected to show up in ways I can't sustain. That's why their response often feels confusing or disproportionate. A small increase in closeness can trigger a sudden pullback. A loving message can be met with silence. Consistency can provoke distance. What looks like indifference is actually self-protection. Effort repels avoidance early on because effort removes choice. The more someone invests quickly, the more the avoidant feels the weight of future responsibility. They sense the emotional trajectory before it's spoken, and their system reacts by slowing everything down, delaying replies, keeping conversations surface level, emphasizing independence. These aren't games. They're attempts to regulate an internal state that's tipping toward overwhelm. The avoidant isn't thinking, I don't want this person. They're thinking, I can't breathe in this dynamic. This is also why logic often replaces emotion in avoidance during early attachment. Logic creates distance. It keeps them from being pulled into a feeling state they don't trust. If they can analyze the connection instead of feeling it, they remain in control. Control equals safety. Emotional surrender, especially early on, feels like stepping into a role they never consented to play. Understanding this reframes the entire dynamic. Avoidants don't resist attachment because they lack depth or desire. They resist it because attachment has historically come at the cost of self. Until their nervous system experiences connection without pressure, love will always feel like something to manage rather than something to move toward. The exact moment attachment begins for an avoidant is not emotional, romantic, or dramatic. It's regulatory. Nothing visibly changes at first. There's no confession, no sudden closeness, no obvious breakthrough. What shifts happens beneath awareness. Inside the nervous system, avoidants don't attach when feelings intensify. They attach when emotional responsibility is removed. Specifically, when you stop trying to manage their moods, anticipate their reactions, or stabilize the relationship for both of you, and instead begin regulating your own emotional state independently. For most people, caring means tuning into the other person's emotional world. For avoidance, that tuning feels intrusive. When someone constantly adjusts themselves to keep the avoidant comfortable, softening needs, suppressing reactions, explaining feelings, wading through distance, the avoidant unconsciously absorbs a sense of responsibility. Even if nothing is said, their body registers it. I am being leaned on. And that sensation triggers resistance, not because they don't care, but because emotional reliance feels like a quiet demand they never agreed to fulfill. But the invisible switch flips when that dynamic changes, when you no longer try to soothe their silence, decode their distance, or rescue the connection from discomfort. When you allow your emotions to rise and fall without pulling them in to stabilize you, when your calm doesn't depend on their consistency, that shift sends a powerful subconscious signal to the avoidance nervous system. You're not responsible for me. And for someone whose system equates responsibility with loss of freedom, that signal feels like relief. This is why avoidants often feel closer to people who seem emotionally self-contained, not cold, not detached, but grounded, regulated. Someone who can experience disappointment without collapsing, uncertainty without chasing, and closeness without gripping. The avoidance body senses that connection with this person won't require constant vigilance. There's no pressure to perform emotionally, no need to manage someone else's inner world. And that safety allows curiosity to emerge where defense once lived. Once their nervous system relaxes, something subtle happens. They lean in, not dramatically, but internally. They start tracking you differently, wondering about you, noticing your absence, feeling a quiet pull instead of an urge to escape. This isn't conscious desire yet, it's somatic orientation. Their body begins to associate you with regulation instead of threat. And for an avoidant, that association is the foundation of attachment. What makes the switch invisible is that it's not triggered by words or actions aimed at them. It's triggered by what you stop doing. You stop chasing emotional clarity. You stop over-functioning in the connection. You stop trying to prove that you're safe to love, and in doing so, you model something their system has rarely experienced: closeness without emotional cost. Attachment, for an avoidant, doesn't begin when they feel overwhelmed by love. It begins when their nervous system realizes it can rest, when being with you doesn't require them to brace, perform, or withdraw. That's the moment they don't just enjoy you anymore, they start orienting toward you. Here's the moment most people miss because it doesn't look like progress from the outside. You become consistent without pursuit. You don't disappear. You don't play games. You don't turn cold or punish their distance. You simply stop chasing connection as if it's something you need to secure. Your presence becomes steady instead of urgent. And that shift quietly changes how the avoidant perceives you. There's no more chasing, no more proving your worth, no more emotional bargaining to keep the connection alive. You're no longer explaining your feelings in hopes they'll understand you better or reassuring them, so they'll stay. You still show up as yourself, warm, responsive, human, but you're no longer available on demand. Your life, mood, and sense of self don't pause while waiting for their attention. And that creates a contrast the avoidant can't ignore. This is when they start watching you differently. Not in a dramatic or possessive way, but with heightened awareness. Their nervous system, which was once focused on maintaining distance, shifts into observation. They notice that you're still kind without trying to pull them closer, that you're still grounded without needing reassurance, that your energy hasn't collapsed or hardened in response to their inconsistency. And that unsettles them, not in a threatening way, but in a disorienting one. Internally, questions begin to surface. Are you really okay without me? That question matters because avoidants are used to being the emotional center of the dynamic, even if they resist it. When you stop orbiting them, their sense of control subtly loosens. Another question follows, did I actually lose control here? Not control in a manipulative sense, but the unspoken control of being needed. And perhaps the most destabilizing question of all, why don't you need reassurance anymore? Because need has always been their leverage, even when they felt burdened by it. This is where curiosity replaces avoidance. Curiosity is attachment's quiet beginning. When an avoidant becomes curious, they're no longer trying to escape the connection. They're trying to understand it. They start paying attention to your patterns, your responses, your absence. Not because they're anxious, but because something feels unfamiliar. You no longer fit into the role they unconsciously assigned you, the one who waits, explains, and adjusts. What makes this moment powerful is that it isn't fueled by fear or intensity. It's fueled by contrast and consistency. You didn't withdraw to provoke a reaction. You didn't demand more. You simply stopped giving more than the sustainable. And in doing so, you communicated something without words. I'm here, but I don't need you to be okay. For an avoidant, that message is disarming. It tells their nervous system that closeness with you doesn't come with emotional debt. And once that realization settles, they don't pull away, they lean in internally first. They begin to feel the early formation of attachment, not as longing or panic, but as interest. And interest is the doorway they never slam shut. Space doesn't scare avoidance. Pressure does. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in avoidant attachment, and it's why so many people misread their reactions. When closeness feels heavy or emotionally demanding, the avoidance instinct is to create distance to breathe again. But when space appears naturally without threat, manipulation, or emotional charge, their nervous system doesn't register danger. It registers relief. And in that relief, something unexpected happens. Attachment deepens instead of dissolving. The key difference is how the space is created. Space used as a tactic. Silence meant to provoke, distance meant to punish. Withdrawal meant to trigger fear, activates the avoidance defenses. The system reads it as instability or control, and they detach further. But space that emerges organically because you are living your life, honoring your rhythms, and no longer chasing connection feels entirely different. There's no emotional demand hidden inside it. No expectation to respond a certain way, no pressure to perform intimacy on cue. When that kind of space exists, the avoidance nervous system does something it rarely does during closeness. It integrates. Instead of being flooded by someone else's emotions, their system has room to process its own. The absence you create isn't filled with fantasy or panic because there's no threat attached to it. You didn't leave in anger. You didn't disappear dramatically. You simply weren't there in the way you used to be. And that subtle absence gives their mind and body permission to register what your presence actually meant. This is when memory activates, not idealization, not regret, but embodied recollection. They remember how they felt around you when there was no pressure. how conversations flowed without expectation, how your presence lowered tension instead of raising it. That memory doesn't arrive loudly, it surfaces quietly, often when they're alone, relaxed, or distracted. And because it wasn't forced, it sticks. Their system begins associating you with calm, not obligation. This is also why avoidants often miss people later rather than immediately. During the relationship, their system was busy managing closeness. Once space arrives, the management stops. Only then can attachment signals come online. Missing you isn't a conscious longing at first, it's a felt absence. Something feels different, quieter, less regulated, and slowly they realize the regulation came from you. What makes this attachment real is that it happens without you reminding them of your value. You're not messaging to stay relevant. You're not explaining what they lost. You're not trying to be remembered. The absence does the throwing on its own. And because the avoidant wasn't pressured into feeling, the feeling belongs to them. It's self-generated. That's why it holds weight. Avoidants don't attach through intensity or proximity. They attach through relief, followed by reflection. When space allows their nervous system to integrate the connection rather than defend against it, attachment forms naturally, not because you pulled away, but because you stopped pushing. Avoidants don't attach through emotion first. They attach through predictable relief. This is where most people misunderstand avoidant bonding because they assume attachment forms through intensity, passion, or emotional expression. For avoidants, it's the opposite. Their system doesn't bond to how deeply you feel. It bonds to how regulated they feel in your presence. Attachment begins not in the heart, but in the body, at the level of the nervous system. Over time, you became the person whose presence lowered tension instead of raising it. Conversations with you didn't require emotional performance. Silence didn't feel dangerous. Connection didn't demand immediate vulnerability or deep disclosure. You didn't escalate emotions to create closeness or push for reassurance when things felt uncertain. Instead, you offered something rare to an avoidant: emotional neutrality, paired with warmth. And their body learned that being around you meant less internal strain. This kind of relief is deeply biological. The nervous system is always scanning for threat or safety, especially in people who learned early on that closeness came with cost. When your presence consistently signaled safety, no pressure, no emotional flooding, no expectation to open up before they were ready, the avoidance body encoded you as a regulator. Not in a dependent way, but in a stabilizing one. You became associated with downshifting, with exhale, with rest. What most people miss is that this bond forms quietly, often without the avoidant realizing it's happening, because there's no emotional drama. It doesn't feel like attachment in the traditional sense. It feels like normalcy, ease, something they don't have to think about. And that's exactly why it's powerful. The nervous system doesn't bond to intensity, it bonds to patterns, and the pattern you created was one of predictable relief. The moment that relief disappears, when your presence is no longer there in the same way, the body notices before the mind does. There's a subtle dysregulation, a low-level tension that wasn't there before. Something feels off, but it's hard to name. This isn't panic, it isn't obsession. It isn't fear of abandonment. It's the absence of a regulating stimulus the body had come to rely on. That's when attachment reveals itself, not through longing, texts, or emotional confessions, but through bodily memory. Their system remembers how it felt to be calmer with you around, how interactions with others feel more effortful, how their baseline state shifted without you. And because this recognition happens internally without external pressure, it carries weight. It's owned, not reactive. This is why avoidants often struggle to articulate what they feel. The attachment didn't begin as an emotion, it began as regulation. And when it's lost, the body registers the loss before the story catches up. That's attachment in its truest form for an avoidant, not obsession, not fear, not regret, but the biological memory of relief that can't be easily replaced. This is the stage that confuses people the most, because the avoidance behavior begins to change, but without any clear explanation. You may notice increased check-ins, subtle bids for connection, or small attempts to re-enter your emotional space. A message that feels casual but intentional. A question they didn't need to ask. A reference to something you shared long ago. These gestures aren't dramatic or emotionally expressive, but they're deliberate. And they don't happen because the avoidant suddenly healed or had a breakthrough in self-awareness. They happen because your absence removed their control. Avoidants often maintain a sense of stability through control, not over other people, but over emotional proximity. They regulate themselves by deciding when closeness happens, how deep it goes, and when it stops. As long as you were consistently available, emotionally responsive, and oriented toward them, that control remained intact. Even if they felt pressured at times, they knew where you were. They knew the connection was waiting, and that predictability allowed them to stay distant without risk. When you step back, not with anger or withdrawal, but with grounded absence, that control quietly dissolves. You're no longer emotionally accessible on demand. You're no longer anchoring the connection by yourself. And for the first time, the avoidant has to feel the relationship instead of managing it. That loss of control doesn't create panic. It creates awareness. They begin to sense the bond because they can no longer contain it. This is when attachment begins to surface behaviorally. Increased check-ins aren't about reassurance. They're about orientation. Subtle bids for connection aren't manipulative. They're exploratory. Testing your availability isn't about power, it's about safety. Their nervous system is asking a new question. Are you still safe to approach? Even if I no longer control the distance, and that question only arises once attachment is already forming internally. What's important here is that safety still remains. You didn't disappear. You didn't become cold or punitive. You didn't weaponize your absence. So while control is gone, threat is not present. That combination is crucial. If control disappears and safety disappears with it, the avoidant detaches. But if control disappears and safety remains, attachment has room to grow. This is also why their approach may feel hesitant or inconsistent. They're not used to moving toward connection without being in charge of the pacing. Each small reach is a test, not of you, but of themselves. Can they tolerate wanting without withdrawing? Can they approach without losing autonomy? These are new internal experiences, and they move slowly. From the outside, it may look like mixed signals. From the inside, it's a system learning a new way to attach. The avoidant isn't suddenly transformed. They're responding to a new dynamic where they can't rely on control to feel safe. And in that space, attachment becomes possible, not because they changed, but because the relationship did. Avoidants don't attach when love feels intense. They attach when love feels non-threatening. This is the truth that contradicts nearly everything people are taught about creating connection. Intensity is often mistaken for intimacy. Effort is confused with depth. But for avoidance, intensity activates defense, not desire. The more charged the emotional environment becomes, the more their nervous system prepares to pull away. Love doesn't draw them closer when it overwhelms them. It draws them closer when it feels safe enough to enter without losing themselves. This is why attachment doesn't form when you chase. Chasing signals urgency. It communicates that the relationship needs to be secured, clarified, or stabilized. Now, to an avoidance system, urgency feels like threat. It suggests future demands, emotional responsibility, and loss of autonomy. And once that signal is received, the instinct is to create distance, not closeness. What looks like disinterest is often a nervous system trying to regain equilibrium. Attachment also doesn't form when you explain. Over-explaining emotions, intentions, or needs can feel grounding to people who bond through verbal reassurance. To an avoidant, it often feels like emotional escalation. Words stack pressure. They imply that something must be understood, processed, or responded to correctly, and when the avoidant senses that they're being pulled into emotional labor before they're ready, they retreat into logic or silence to protect themselves. Waiting doesn't create attachment either. Waiting keeps you emotionally available while suppressing your own movement. It communicates patience, but it also communicates self-abandonment. And avoidants don't bond to people who pause their lives for them. That dynamic reinforces control and removes the contrast needed for attachment to form. As long as you're waiting, the avoidant doesn't have to feel the bond. They can manage it from a distance. Attachment forms when you become steady without needing them. When your emotional center of gravity shifts back to yourself, when your consistency comes from self regulation, not from monitoring their behavior, you're still warm, still open, still human, but your stability no longer depends on their availability. And that steadiness is what makes you safe. In that space, the avoidance nervous system finally relaxes. There's no demand hidden in your presence, no urgency in your absence, just a quiet reliability that doesn't cost them their autonomy. And once love feels non threatening, they stop racing against it. They don't have to manage it, they don't have to escape it. They can simply experience it. That's the exact moment realization sets in. Not as a dramatic epiphany, but as a subtle knowing. They didn't just enjoy you. They didn't just feel comfortable around you, they bonded with you because you were the one place connection didn't require defense.